Well, good morning. Good morning. How are you? Good. Hey, we were having a conversation in our worship team huddle before service this morning. Candy. It's candy. How many of you are about to give out some candy? Give some candy. That's a nice. Never mind. I was going to make an inappropriate thing that said my wife that just walked past is a nice piece of candy. But I won't do that. And Jesus, come and hand me. How many, will you settle a debate for me? Just scream it out. What's some of the worst, I really want to hear from the student. What's some of the worst candy that someone can give tomorrow night? Scream it out. What's some of the worst? You're not looking for it. Candy corn? Tots? Dots. Yeah, what else? Licorice, Tootsie Rolls, Werthers. Almond Joy. We're Almond Joy. All right, now, okay, so that's good. Now, what's some of the best candy that you all are looking forward to? Wow, Reese's, Kingdom, that's heaven on earth. What else? Heath, okay, said one person. Snickers, Sour Patch, I like it. Okay, now, if you're a giver of candy tomorrow instead of a receiver of candy, I would like for you to assess what you are giving out based on what your people are saying you should or should not be giving out. And how many of you, now that we know what candy is the best and what's the worst, will categorize people and their character and their personhood based on the sort of candy they give out tomorrow? Anyone honest enough to admit that if you're handing me some chocolate-covered raisins, there's something about you that I'm not for? Yes. So I want to urge us in the spirit of being kingdom people to leave your judgments of people and their candy literally at the door, as the pun would go and work perfectly in that moment. My kids are upstairs having a great time at the Halloween party, wearing their Halloween outfits for the third time when we bought cheap ones that we planned to make it through one, and I don't know that they're going to make it. These Elsa and Anna dresses from Amazon, I didn't know that we were dressing up this many times, and so they're tattered, they're torn, and I'm going to tell you, we're too cheap to buy another one. So if you see our kids in the pictures, don't judge us. They're just party animals. And speaking of parties, segue. Next week, I want to let you know that after service, we're offering our first kind of beta run at what we're calling Bridge Church Basics. And this is for anyone of all ages, if you've been here for 40 years or for 4 minutes, and you're looking to understand more about who we are, where we're heading, and how you can take a step to hear more about our philosophy of ministry and where we're trying to go in the coming season. We'd love to invite you into that. And there's 2 ways you can connect to that. One is just let us know on a Connect card that's in all the boxes and seat backs, but also in our app, you can register there as well. And I want to point you to 2 things when it comes to our kids and students as well. After service today, Brandon and the team are hosting a parent kind of connect lunch. After service upstairs, you did not have to pre-register. We have more sandwiches than you could possibly, I hope we run out, but I think we have enough. And we're also hosting an event in partnership with NECO. If you're interested in learning more about foster care, what step you can take, hear about how you can be a participant, and I believe that God would ask us as a church, as followers of Jesus, in ways that are unique to us, how we can all be part of that. And I'm pretty sure, even if you didn't register, we'll have plenty of sandwiches in the building and childcare available to feed you. So there's 2 places you can go today after service. And next week, we're also going to bring the kids back in for our time of worship. So parents, pay attention to socials. And then our students are going to head back upstairs during the message to begin some new rhythms of figuring that out. Last bit of housekeeping. We've talked about in the last few weeks as we are becoming Bridge Church, one of the key ways to be a full participant in the life and the trajectory of our church family is to serve. And so we've been spotlighting different teams, and I want to point you towards our Impressions team. These are all the fine people you see on parking lots and doors, acting as ushers, a little bit of crossover with our kids team, helping with check-in. And the whole idea of the Impressions team is to create welcoming and disarming and hospitable environments so others can be seen, known, and loved. And our whole idea behind what it means to serve here is always to belong to a community, to belong to a team far before you belong or do the things. So if you're at all interested in joining our Impressions team, I want you to know, if we're being really honest, this is one of the most accessible entry points into serving on a team. And so if you're looking to explore that, connect with some new people and help us just love people as they come in and feel the expression of our hearts through hospitality, you can be part of that. And Katie will be in the lobby after service today to help you take that step, or you can just let us know incognito on your connection card. And with all of that said, I'm going to bring Mark Beacom up to the stage today, and he is going to read our text, which comes from Luke 19, verses 1 through 10. So as he comes, would you all stand? And this is a familiar story, and I hope that we can translate it from the song that it's immediately going to put in your head if you're a good church kid, and into something we can do together. So Mark, read us our text, my friend.
Good morning. Matt's going to be teaching out of Luke 19, verses 1 through 10, about Jesus and Zacchaeus. Verse 1, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So Zacchaeus hurried and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it all, they grumbled, he has gone to be with the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will restore it fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, since he is also a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost.
Thank you, sir. You all can be seated. Y'all need to get to know Mark's story and how deep that last sentence is in his story and in the passion of his heart. So in my humble opinion, the best 20 minutes in all of professional sports happens when almost no one else is watching. Any guesses? Steph Curry is one of the most famous athletes in the world. He's a superstar basketball player for the Golden State Warriors and is famous for being the best shooter in NBA history. He holds the NBA record for the most career three-point field goals. And on top of his many in-game heroics and accolades, he is famous for his pre-game warm-up routine. You're going to see a little bit of it on the screen behind me. It is a 20-minute extravaganza of dribbling skills, shooting drills, movement drills, in-game shots, and trick shots. It starts 90 minutes before tip-off, and it's well before there's an arena full of people and like the mandated team warm-up begins. He never does it alone. It's always in partnership with a guy named Bruce Frazier, who's the Warriors player and development coach. And Steph's career is marked by being a highlight reel of shooting. He's an incredible shooter. He's deadly accurate despite his comparatively smaller size. He's able to create space and bury teams routinely. Anybody impressed with this dribbling routine yet? Yeah. Why? How is he able to do that? It has something to do in his preparation and his relentless devotion to fitness, health, and an overall set of skills. Now, I know you're so distracted by his skill. Now, you might think that the best shooter of all time, as his career progresses, a couple of things would happen. You'd probably think, and be inclined to think, that he wouldn't even have to practice shooting as much anymore because he's broken the records, he's the dude, he's the greatest of all time. Or you might also think that he wouldn't need to practice anything else but his shooting. But you watch this warm-up, and you quickly find that that's not the case. One of his coaches said in an interview recently that he's just in love with getting better. And his pregame routine, check this, has to do more with the pursuit of growth and preparation for the big moment than it does skill development or just trying to avoid injury. So let's pull that from the screen so I can have their attention back. It's about preparation and it's about practice. Everybody say practice. Why? Why is this true for Steph Curry? Well, one of the things that he said is because Steph Curry knows that you never mature beyond the basics. In fact, there is no such thing as maturity without the basics. Greatest shooter of all time spends 20 minutes pregame doing dribbling drills. You never mature beyond the basics. Pull that principle out of the realm of basketball and apply it to the conversation we've been having around spiritual formation and your apprenticeship with Jesus. It means that as we, if you've picked up on this language, practice the way of Jesus together to become people of love, as Jesus defines it, you and I never mature beyond the basics. Be with Jesus, become like Jesus, do what Jesus did. That's how we define what it means to follow Jesus. It's the goals that we are trying to reorganize our lives and our church around. And it is a huge shift to our paradigms, and it's a huge shift to our daily habits. And my hope today and next week is just to begin to lay out a few more ways that we can begin to take this massive endeavor called holistic, wholehearted apprenticeship to Jesus and begin to make it more and more accessible. And if you were here last week and you heard my ending illustration of the difference between casually looking and interacting with our discipleship to Jesus like a painting in a museum versus an immersive experience with Jesus and with our full self, then the question you might be asking that I have not began to answer is, how? That is beautiful. Loved the painting, Davis. How? Give me a step. How do I do that? How do I become that kind of person? And I believe that the answer lies somewhere in this idea that you and I never mature beyond the basics. We never mature beyond the basics. In fact, if we've left the basics in the past or have never began to apply the basics of a personal apprenticeship to Jesus, then I would question what is maybe we call maturity, but we may actually just be blending in a culture that's kind of Jesus-y. Okay? So there's the tension. There's the rub that we face. But in that tension is the deepest and most profound opportunity that's before your life. And for many of us, that my sense is that the intersection between, follow this, the intersection between Jesus as a shared cultural set of ideas and concepts that we identify with and kind of interact with like a museum painting versus Jesus as an entire way of life, like an immersive experience that is changing you and I from the inside out, and it's shaping your identity, and it's mending your brokenness, and it's aligning your passions, that is the very explanation behind why so many of us are struggling to change and to mature and to transform and to even find the value in the pain of that process to begin with. In my pastoral sense, the deepest parts of my heart for us in our future and for you and your family, what I'm trying to call us towards and laboring for in these weeks is that you and I must return for some and begin for others to a reoriented and reframed commitment to the basics. We need to awaken our desire for it first, and then we need to challenge our paradigms. And then it needs to get down in us and change what we do with our lives and our bodies and our time and our habits. And then we need to do lots and lots of dribbling drills. and wake up and do dribbling drills every single day, whether we feel like it or not. Because the moment will come in your life, whether it's the big shot or the big letdown, where because of years worth of the dribbling drills in your soul, you will find a meaning and a strength that makes the difficult times sufferable and makes the good times fall into your lap because of the unseen reality of immersing yourself in a life with God day in and day out and day in and day out, whether the outcomes were there or not. You tracking? Because, why? Because following Jesus is more than a set of ideas and concepts and a belief that we hold in our heads, but it's something we do with our entire person. It's not just something we believe and share as a shared ethic and sense of morality of what we should and should not do to belong and not be seen as bad. And as a church, where we are going together and where I am trying to invite us towards and where I am struggling to live myself is one of maturity, increased maturity, and practice. And we will never get there without the basics. And I hate to say it out loud, but I want to be very honest along this journey that I'm trying to drag us into, and I'm trying to drag my entire person into, is that all growth is painful, and it tends to begin with a painful cutting away of things, of ideas, of habits, of paradigms. And in case you don't believe me, I'll just tell you, that's how Jesus framed it. In John 15, go read that chapter, his words on abiding and the imagery he uses about vine and branches and cutting away and burning the stuff away. It's a painful process to grow up. But with that said, my vision for Bridge Church is to redesign and to pioneer ways of doing life and community in ways that we can live in together for decades to come. A way that produces transformation and healing for all of our stories and for all of our souls in unique ways and always for the sake of others. And to begin, just like Steph Curry's pregame ritual, we have to realize that you and I never mature beyond the basics. So wherever you are on that journey today, the invitation is the same. And it's always to remain an active participant in your journey with Christ and to always take a step. That's a lot. Why did you read Zacchaeus? Where does he fall in this? Before we get to Zacchaeus, are you all ready for a Dallas Willard quote? Yes, Dallas Willard. There's Jesus, then there's Dallas Willard, and then there's, I don't know. I really like Dallas Willard. We can have whatever. Here's what he says. He says that one of the problems that many Christians today have is that since they are Christians, they have found it, and they stop seeking. But seeking is the way we live. We never get beyond seeking, and it has many dimensions. One of the most important is that God wants to be wanted. He wants to be sought. That is why he doesn't just run over us. So with that said, let's look at this familiar life of Zacchaeus. How many of you, when Mark was reading that, your brain went to the felt board and the children's song? Anybody singing the song in your head even right now, and it will never get out of your head? You're welcome for that. Those that don't have that song in your head, that's okay. Just look around the people bobbing their heads and their eyes getting increasingly weird through the service because they can't get over it. But here's the thing. I want us to re-look at this, and I want you to try to erase, if you have a history of this story, I want you to try to graduate your perspective beyond, oh, that's the funny song about a guy that went in a tree, and to look at it through the lens of formation in the way of Jesus. Let's look at this verse by verse. Chapter 19, verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. Set the stage with a quick note about the bigger story that's happening and what Luke has been telling. Starting in Luke's narrative about chapter 9, Luke's narrative begins to describe Jesus' journey back towards Jerusalem and what we now know was going to be his moment of crucifixion and the resurrection. And chapter after chapter, story after story, encounter after encounter, Jesus is just working his way back, and he's teaching, and he's doing some miracles, and he's healing some people, and he's slowing down to be interrupted. And along the way, he just keeps dropping like these massive hints of what's about to come, and it's just going over everyone's heads. And here in verse 1, notice what's happening. Jesus is passing through. He's on his way to Jerusalem. He's not here intending to have a predetermined encounter with Zacchaeus on his calendar. He's on his way through. He's on the final 20-mile stretch walking back to Jerusalem. And he's becoming, if you were to read it, you would see that his sense of I'm about to do something big is just getting bigger and bigger. He's a man on a mission at this point. Verse 2, and a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. Now, Zacchaeus is a Jewish guy, and he did the thing that you shouldn't do. It was that Rome is occupying his people, and he kind of switches sides, and he collects his taxes to pay the people that are occupying. Not a good thing, not going to make you a lot of friends, and he's becoming wealthy because of it. And he's in a town called Jericho that sits in the valley. It's along the Jordan River Valley, and it is a massive trade center. And there's a lot of money to be made as the tax collector. And so this guy is just exchanging relationships with his people, betraying them, he's seen that way, to make $1. But something significant is about to be said as Luke recaptures this story. And this is where I want you to try to hear this and slowly interact with it. And here's what Luke says about Zacchaeus in verse 3. That he wanted to see who Jesus was. He wanted to see who Jesus was. All personal growth starts with a desire, right? It always starts with a desire. You want to lose some weight, you have to have a desire to do it. You want to get better at your craft, it begins with a desire to do it. You want to go back to school and get another degree, it begins with a desire to do it. You want to have a deepening relationship with someone that's important, it begins with a desire. All personal growth starts with desire. And more, this elusive idea of more, better, gooder, whatever you're thinking, more always requires more, unless we will just plateau in life. And notice Zacchaeus' posture here. He's about to have a transformational experience that's not just about he was the funny guy in a tree and we wrote a song about it. Zacchaeus' transformation and his moment of formation began with a curiosity. That his entire journey with Jesus began with curiosity and with desire. And the older I get, in the massively old age of 36, I'm becoming a sage, 36. I've learned about all there is to learn, guys. That's a joke. But the older I get, the more I realize that for most of us, despite our best intentions, despite the limits that we have, I don't mean this as mean as it's going to sound. So don't think about you. Just think about the other people for a second. You have permission for a second. The older I get, the more I realize that we basically do what we want to do. Is that kind of true? We basically do what we want to do. We will move mountains to overcome logistical impossibilities to the things we actually want to do. And then we will run the opposite direction if there's just a granule of opposition to something we actually don't want to do. We kind of basically do what we want to do. At a baseline level, we do what we want to do. And that could be a negative thing. But it can also speak to something inherent that's about us. That means, at the core of who we are, the reason that you do most of what you do actually begins with, what do I want to do? We actually are reflections of what we want, what we desire. At the core of how God made you is this whole internal place of longing and desire and love and affection. And wherever that lands is actually more about what we do with our lives. And it seems to me, at least in Zacchaeus' story, and for sure in Ted Lasso's story, that it seems like curiosity is like a signal. It's a signal of our deepest desires and longings. And that when our deepest desires get matched up to Jesus, it actually changes everything. And it begins to be the gateway to some growth and change. And I want to say this. If you feel stuck today, if you feel very plateaued, or just struggling in your apprenticeship to Jesus, or struggling in your life, or struggling in your marriage, or struggling in your singleness, one of your first steps is likely to do something with answering the question, what do you want? What do you desire? And is that desire fixed on the one thing that actually will solve your deepest desires? He wanted, I'll quit laboring the point, he wanted to see Jesus. He wanted, it wasn't, he felt like he had to see Jesus. He wanted to see Jesus. And by all accounts, Zacchaeus is not a Jesus follower. There's something curious, there's something powerful, there's something happening in the fabric of his shared culture. And in fact, he knew that he's going to have to cross categories, do some things that are embarrassing and vulnerable and public to be able to see Jesus. But it all started with what? He wanted to see Jesus. Who do you want to see? Who do you want to become? What do you want the future of your family to be? What do you want to be as a spouse? What do you want to be as a boss, a leader, a coworker? What do you want to be? Interesting question, isn't it? It continues. He wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short, all the short people in the room give a whoop, whoop. I'm just kidding. They're too embarrassed to do that. And their voices get muffled by the chairs right in front of them. But because he was short, Jesus forgive me. That's the second inappropriate. Third strike, and I'm out. Anyways, he could not see over the crowd. Pay attention to two things. He was short, and he couldn't see over the crowd. Interesting. Zacchaeus, he wanted to see Jesus. His desire led to an action, a pursuit, what Dallas Willard just talked about as seeking. And then Luke tells us that immediately had to come to terms with two things. The fact that he is short and the fact that there was a crowd. Let's think of that in terms of he had to come to terms with his own limits and he had to come to terms with his own context. Limits and context. Your desire for anything in life, but particularly a desire to follow Jesus with your whole life, will always rub up and come against your own limits and your context. Let's talk about that for a second. Limits and context. Think about your limits in your own context right now, and just think about how they are fighting and working against you to actively pursue and follow Jesus. And now I want you to trick yourself. Do the reverse psychology thing. Think of your limits, and now see it as a gift. Why in the world could your limits be a gift? How can that be? I think the answer has something to do with the fact that our limits constantly remind us of our need. And the tricky part about embracing our limits, coming face to face with our need, is to not let it push us into despair, but to push us into desperation. That was nice. Two words that started with D, very preachy of me. I'll say it again. The trick about our limits is to not let it push us into despair, but to let us push us into desperation. And I've often heard that God works in our lives by consent. He often works by consent. He doesn't come and kick down the door in your life. But he's always looking for kind of an invitation. He doesn't come storming into our lives and inviting himself where he's not invited. And I think that's true. But I also know that there's something about the way God works and how much he actually cares, is that you don't have to kick the door wide open, very far open. You just have to begin with I want to, and I think he's already there. I want to see, oh, there he is. Oh my goodness, the huckleberries. They're everywhere. I want to see Jesus. And so in your limits is a profound opportunity to express your need to a God that wants to be needed and wants to make himself present to you. He was short, and all of a sudden, he admitted it. And then what did he do? He had to face the context of the crowd. Now, I've traveled a little bit. Nothing to brag about. Jared's going to dog me for saying that out loud, that I have traveled some. And I've been to some fast-paced, secular environments. I've also been inside cultures where to be Christian was to be seen as stupid or irrelevant or hostile or anti-modern. I've also been in a few places where, I didn't fit. I didn't fit at all. And when it comes to like the sort of context that exists for us in apprenticing with Jesus, those are out there, but that's not our context. That's not the valley. That's not what we live and breathe. Our context is pretty different. In our context is an interesting blend of like good cultural and Christian values. It's a good place to live with a lot of good people. I'm down on that. It's not bad. I know I say that a lot, and you're probably like, man, he's really hateful. I'm really not. I try not to. Maybe I overemphasize things, and it can be taken away, but it's your fault. Just kidding. That was very pastoral. Anyways, but let's be honest. Inside of that sort of ecosystem where things kind of live and ride in the middle, it's not like post-Christian, but it's not like 1950 conservative fundamental. Like, it's somewhere in this weird middle. It's easy for us to become stuck. It's easy for us to get stuck because it's just easy to blend in. It's easy for us not to have to take our apprenticeship to Jesus very deeply because at the surface level, we're all kind of living out that thing, right? And it's easier for us to blend in at the expense of our own maturity and our apprenticeship to Jesus. And one of the actually very challenging aspects of trying to seriously apprentice with Jesus in the valley is that our context is pro that, and it has a pretty healthy baseline of that and shared ideas and cultures, which just makes it so easy to be like, oh, I just don't have to do these things and show up to one of these buildings on Sundays and try to keep my life together and I'm good? Like, that's a challenge. That's an actual challenge. And so our context has that going on, but I want to name another struggle in that area. And we face a context in which you and I want to say it, mainly because of this thing, so unbelievably distracted that we could be like walking through life inside of the world's greatest immersive painting or a huckleberry bush with an IV drip of huckleberry juice and being pelted by huckleberries in the face, and we'd be like, huh? Yeah, that's cool. Oh man, I'm really feeling off today. Something's wrong. I'm feeling like God's really distant. Boom, boom. Nope. Like, and I don't mean that harsh and like either or. I'm just saying, like, our context, history's yet to tell just what the level of distraction that this is bringing into our lives, that we're making trade-offs to our personhood and our psyche and our relationships, that it'll take decades to explain that story. So all I'm saying is, like, when it comes to your life, write this on your mirror. If you have one of those vision boards, whatever, like, write this. Like, I want to trade distraction for presence. I want to trade distraction for presence. I want to trade that. Zacchaeus was curious. He wanted to see Jesus. His desire came alive, and then he had to face his limits and his context. And now we get to the children's church moment. But for me, it's actually through adult eyes, like, this is one of the most profoundly human, vulnerable moments in this entire story. Here it is, verse 4. So the short guy ran ahead, and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, Jesus, since Jesus was coming that way. Hold on a second. Put that through like really sarcastic lens for a second. You're telling me there's a crowd of people and the short guy's running through it, throwing elbows, and then to see the guy he wants to do, he has to get up in a tree? That's pretty embarrassing. That's pretty embarrassing. The short guy is getting up in the tree, but not only is he the short guy, he's the traitor. He's the guy that's ripping off his friends. He's the one making a scene in front of the people that he's stealing from and becoming wealthy off of, and that he is actively working against. And I don't know, I'm just imagining this into the text, so don't take this as a case in point interpretation of what's happening here. But we all know, like, that whole thing, short man syndrome, like where if you're shorter in stature, sometimes you got to act a little bit more to make up for it. Can you imagine having that to wrestle with, but also being the guy that has to appear a certain way to get the people that already hate you to pay money to you because you're taking it from them on behalf of the occupant? Like, all I'm trying to say is it would be embarrassing to be the short guy that's not liked, to run through a crowd and then climb a tree to see this dude that you've only heard of and you don't yet No, he's running. That is undignified. Just think about that. And all joking aside, for Zacchaeus, that's a pretty real human moment of a public display of vulnerability, isn't it? Desire, facing his limits, facing his context, and then a profound, risky, embarrassing moment of public vulnerability. And I said a minute ago that it seems to me that often God works by consent. Well, what is consent? It's vulnerability. My sense is that vulnerability is what often unlocks the good that can come on the other side of being shut off. Your life's a wreck. What are you vulnerable to? Who are you vulnerable to? Who are you giving voice to in your life? And you know, I've talked about it, like I'm very pro-therapy, and therapy has saved lives, and it is saving lives, and it's restoring and healing marriages. But for any of that to work, it requires brutal honesty and vulnerability. Zacchaeus publicly displayed his vulnerability. Why? It doesn't tell us anything about Zacchaeus' motives other than what? He wanted to see Jesus. He was willing to check his ego and risk embarrassment. And then what happens? Jesus walks by in 5 and 6. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, you come down, for we're going to your house today. Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Check out these words, immediately and today. Think about the broader picture. Where is Jesus on his way to? He's going through Jericho to what? To Jerusalem, to do this cosmic act of forgiveness and reconciliation and dealing with sin. You know, just a little part of Jesus' story, the thing that's a pretty big deal for all of us. He's on the way to do that. And Jesus, in his kindness and in his fatherly love and in his goodness, he looks up. He responds to the one that is wanting to see him. He interrupts the cosmic story, but he's like, I'm a man on a mission. Come down now. We're going to your house today. And what greater picture of who God is in our lives when it comes to our desire, our facing of our limits, our facing of our context and vulnerability, then what are we met with? We're met with God himself in this port, represented as Jesus, who's on a global, cosmic, historical moment, but he slows down enough and he pays attention and he says, I'm going to whose house? I'm going to your house. I'm going to your house. When? Today. And I want to say to us for a moment, one of the things that we can take from that is you're entertaining this idea of being with Jesus, putting your life before him to become more like him and to do the basics. Let me say this that may be like, well, yeah, duh. But let me also say it in a way that maybe the Spirit would deposit this deep down in your person, that I want you to ever think, regardless of how other people have treated you, regardless of how your parents have treated you, and regardless of the lies that you believe in your own head about yourself, never think that you are an interruption to God. You're never an interruption to God. He is on his way to Jerusalem to do the thing. And he sees the guy that's earnestly looking for him, and he stops it. And in that, he does something that's pretty symbolic of making another point. Verse 7. All the people saw this, and instead of saying, I want to see Jesus too, it's not what they said. They began to mutter. He's gone to be the guest of a sinner. And what's going on here? Well, there's a lot. But for starters, I want you to see certain things that speak to Bridge Church and that whole idea of crossing boundaries and living in the gaps and creating space for this stuff, is that Jesus is defying immediately their secular sacred divide. He's immediately defying that. He's blowing up their categories. He's challenging their insider versus outsider culture of who's good enough to meet with this guy and who can't be. He's breaking up their religious categorizing of people. He's saying, whether you give me Werther's Original or a Reese peanut butter cup king size, you are welcome, and I'm going to your house today. But then after the relationship flourishes, he's definitely inviting you to do Reese's only. But that's okay. He's living in what we talked about a few weeks ago called the redemptive edge. You may remember. But it's that space where all of the meaningful stuff happened for Jesus. It's that space between the criticism of the religious and then like the irrelevance or the hostility of those that are like secular and anti and opposed to that. And that, I want to say, is like, this is an interesting dynamic. That because part of the context, sadly, part of the context that you and I face in desiring to seek Jesus more is not just what those out there will think of us. It's what those in here will think of us. Chill, bro. You're taking this thing way too serious. I tried that in my 30s too when I was going through my midlife and it sucked. Let me protect you from all of that. Don't risk it. Don't bet the farm. Keep things the way they are. This is where my safety and comfort. Don't do that. The response of the religious crowd around him wasn't like, oh my goodness, even he got to be with Jesus. That means there's hope for me. I want it too. It was like, oh, well, that doesn't fit my categories. So either Jesus isn't who I actually want or who I thought he is or who I want him to be based on my terms, or I don't have any answers for that. But I'm not willing to face that. You tracking? And so when the great temptations in our future together is actually not what others will think. It's what you and I will think of each other as we take our apprenticeship to Jesus more seriously. And we will have to reconcile that. We will have to deal with that. And what that means also is a lot more like loving confrontation in our midst. And it means a lot more support. Where the love can go deeper, the grace and the support must go deeper. But also the higher the expectation becomes over time. But not in a religious way. Not in an inside or out way, but in a way that Jesus defined it. In a very mysterious, are our lives increasing in their capacity for love for God and people? And are we doing the basics? Are we humbly doing the basics? But not to do the basics, but to know God and be changed by doing the basics. The difference. And so that's all the sort of stuff that we're going to have to work through. And then verses 8 through 10, I got to speed up. Zacchaeus stood up. This is where like the real formational, transformational moment. Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, look, here now I give half my... So he's encountered Jesus. His desire is met with acceptance and love. We're going to your house today. And what immediately shifts? A practice, a behavior, a thing is changing. And not only that, but anyone that I ripped off previously, I'm going to pay him back fourfold. I'm going to make it right. In verse 9, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. And then he speaks like, this is who I am. This is what I'm on the journey of, because the Son of Man came to what? Seek and save the lost. His heart gets turned in such a way that his first response isn't, can you teach me the doctrines? It's his behavior changed in a way that he became generous. Because why? That's who Jesus is. His belief led to new practices. And Jesus, who's in the middle of this cosmic journey to Jerusalem to settle a pretty big thing, does this for Zacchaeus, and then he paints a big picture and says, but listen, I am for more than Zacchaeus, because I, the Son of Man, who you still don't really know what that means, came to seek and save the lost. And it's just a profoundly amazing moment. And Zacchaeus' formational moment began with curiosity and desire. And he faced his own limits in his own context. And then out of his desperation, he risked embarrassment, and he bet the farm on his image and his person and probably his ability to collect. If this didn't happen, I mean, imagine the what if. If Jesus didn't see him and he made a fool of themselves for the case of Jesus, do you think people are going to be as intimidated to keep giving him their money? I don't know. Just a curious question I have. He bet the farm on his image and persona to Jesus, and what did he find? He found Jesus. And he was with him in his own home, which transformed into a place of healing and salvation and in a place where heaven came and met earth, like it did for Jacob in the field and Ezekiel in the house in the refugee camp, and it did for Paul on the island of Patmos, and it did for Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. I'm looping back to last week. And it became a sacred space because Jesus came where he was wanted, and it changed everything. And before you're tempted to write this down and go all Western post-enlightenment on us and make this a formula that we can repeat, I want you to know Zacchaeus' life is not a formula for ours, but it does show us something that's important to the conversation that we're having, something that's important to getting you past the struggle, the plateau, or the outright lack of desire, or just the fact that you're really, really trying and it's not going anywhere and you're tempted to give up. When it comes to your journey with Jesus and your own spiritual formation, I want to say that it won't just happen. You must be intentional. Steph Curry isn't the greatest shooter in NBA history because he was born to a really good shooter and went to a bunch of NBA games, and then in high school was pretty decent, and every now and then he shoots still. He's the best shooter in NBA history because he's never quit doing dribbling drills and staying in shape and tried to be in such his body being peak condition so he doesn't get injured. And so that when the moments come, he's not too tired. And so that it's just a matter of muscle memory for him to lift a shot from sometimes what feels like 90 feet away and it goes in. He's not even thinking about it. It's who he has become. You see the difference? It just won't happen. And part of how we talk about that is through what we call practices. Part of how we intentionally follow Jesus is through what we will call practices. And so I'm wrapping up. Zacchaeus' formational journey started with the desire to see Jesus, and then he intentionally did some things. So then for us, if the goal of following Jesus is to become a person of love, and if we do that by orienting our lives around being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing what Jesus did, and we know that it doesn't happen unintentionally, it only happens intentionally, the question then is, how? How do we posture our life? How do we posture all of who we are to know and experience that? How do we practice the way of Jesus? Well, part of that answer is it's practices. Why? Because we never mature beyond the basics. And in fact, there is no maturity without the basics. And for today, I want to name those. I'm going to blitz them in front of you, and then next week, we're going to talk about our paradigm for that and what each of these can mean and give you a bite-sized chunk to participate in there. And those 9 practices are this. There's more there could be, but these are 9 that we're lining up with some other people to say this is how we practice the way of Jesus together. It's through the practice of Sabbath, prayer, fasting, solitude, scripture, community, simplicity, generosity, and hospitality. You'll see every dimension of being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing what Jesus did in this list. And this will shape for years to come, and will take years to hone and become part of who we are and how we do life to orient our lives around this. These are our dribbling drills. These are the basics. And spiritual formation is not the practices, and practices is not spiritual formation, but they are the container and the accelerator for changing into a person of love. And your spiritual formation never graduates past these practices. And for most of us, this is the more accessible starting point that will lead and guide us into deepening aspects of your soul's healing and formation. They will help you take bite-sized chunks at this thing called apprenticing with Jesus. How do you eat an elephant? 1 bite at a time. How did Jesus speak the Sermon on the Mount? You've heard it said, I say, go do this little small thing. You want to become like Jesus? Go do this little small thing and do it over and over again. Jesus already showed us what we're learning in the modern age, that information alone is never what produces formation. And so I want to end with this invitation, and the invitation is this. Here's our small bite-sized chunk today. Above and before any of it, I want you to ask God to make you like Zacchaeus, that you want to see Jesus. If we don't have that, we're just doing things. We're just looking for the benefits. And listen, we all have starting points. I get it. We all have realities of our own hurt and our questions, our hang-ups, and that's very real. But for all the words that we say, and I really don't mean this in a jerk of a way, despite how it may sound, we pretty much live our lives in response to this question. What do I want? What do I want? What do I want? So let me ask you, what do you want? For Zacchaeus, his formation started with, I want to see Jesus. And so I want to name 3 perspectives that you may be approaching that question with. First is, they are saint, sleepwalker, and skeptic. It's a spectrum of how you may be thinking about this. Maybe you're identifying as a saint right now, or that's your goal. I just want to grow and become a mature follower of Jesus. You're giving this apprenticeship thing your best shot. It's a struggle, but you're going after it. Things may be going well, they may not be going well, but you feel grounded. You feel like this is the meaning of my life. You may feel stuck, you may feel plateaued, you may feel like you're on the thing, but you're on that side. I'm giving it my all. I'm trying. Saint. Then there's another. Then there's the sleepwalker. It's for those of us that may be here most weeks, but if you're honest, you're pretty bored and you're struggling to see the value of all this. And your imagination really belongs to your career trajectory or your favorite sports team or next weekend's adventure. Your following of Jesus is mainly based in blending in with our cultural values while your soul is just asleep at the wheel. And you long for more, but you don't want to wake yourself up, because to wake yourself up is to feel all that you might encounter. And it may cost something. And then there's the skeptic. You're the husband who's trying to please your wife by showing up here on the weekends, but in your head and heart, you don't see the point. You're the midlifer looking around and saying, this thing I grew up on, it just hasn't panned out like I was told it would, and so I have more skepticism than hope. You're the doubter that's looking for a safe place to explore your questions and your hesitation, but you're fearful to take a step because you feel like you're going to expose your short stature in a crowd and they're going to laugh you out of the place. You're the brainiac that's trying to find how 2 + 2 = 4 in this whole spirituality thing, and you can't square it all together. Saint, sleepwalker, skeptic. Maybe for you it's something entirely different. But here's the invitation that I'm giving you. Pay attention to your desires and invite Jesus to meet you there. Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus, and guess what happened? He did, and it changed everything. So I'm going to ask you to stand. Go ahead. And I want to lead you in a moment of reflection. And I want to actually do something maybe you've done before, maybe you've never done before. This may be a way of introduction into a type of prayer that you may practice on your own. And it's called imaginative prayer. It comes from the order of Ignatius in the 15th, 16th century. And all it is that it is an active way of praying that engages your mind and your heart and stirs up thoughts and emotions. It's praying in partnership with your imagination. So I'm going to invite you to close your eye for a moment if you would be willing. No one's going to touch you, ask you to do anything publicly vulnerable. This is just between you and God in this moment. But I would invite you to practice this. And the first thing I want you to do is I want to kind of take your imagination, take your internal world, and ask God to kind of calm the scattered senses and thoughts and questions you're having right now, to focus on a moment. And that moment to be similar like the scene with Zacchaeus. And I want you to picture yourself somewhere, maybe it's a comfortable spot, maybe it's your favorite spot in the world, where you're actively looking for Jesus. Picture yourself in your mind's eye, actively looking for Jesus. And maybe as you're doing that right now, your limits and your obstacles and your context is showing itself. And see if you can just maneuver past that, settle it. And picture Jesus beginning to pass by this place that you are. Maybe you're sitting, you're standing. Maybe you're in a tree like Zacchaeus. Maybe you're in your deer stand. And Jesus begins to pass by. And you've been looking and hoping, but here he is. And he didn't pass by. He actually is looking up, and you find yourself locking eyes with him. And now he's coming towards you. He's coming over to you. And whatever he had going on, he's making time to be with you. And a conversation is starting. In your imagination, maybe you're walking, maybe you're sitting, maybe you're on a bench, maybe you're back in your home, maybe you're in this spot that when you think of the most beautiful place on earth, this is where you are. I want you to invite God's Spirit into this moment in such a way that you begin to listen to what Jesus might be saying to you. For Zacchaeus, he wanted to see Jesus, and then Jesus showed up. And as you're imagining that, if you sense God speaking and you're like, wow, this is really weird or mystical, is this God or is this the pizza that I ate last night? I don't know what it is. I want you to know that in this moment of vulnerability, that's a step. But if you sense maybe in a powerful way that there's a clear thing that Jesus might be saying to you, know that his words are always actionable. He says, let there be light, and there was light. And so whatever he might be saying to you is also something that he could be doing in you. And so wherever you are, whatever you're sensing, whatever hesitation, wherever you are, Jesus, as a community looking to follow you more deeply, as people looking to be healed and restored, to find our futures in you and our purpose in you, God, we are inviting you to speak to us, maybe in this exact moment. Maybe our mind is going to a conversation of a few days ago, and that's what your mind can't go away from, and there's new life and new meaning in the conversation all of a sudden. Or maybe this is just training our perspective to be open to what you might do or say to us in the days or weeks to come. Whatever it is, God, we are asking to see you. We want our desire to be for you first. And whatever hesitations we have, we don't discount. Whatever hurts we have, I'm not acting like they don't exist. Whatever skepticism is in the room, I'm not dogging that or judging that. God, I pray that you will help us to just be vulnerable to the fact that maybe in this exact moment, in our stage of life, in our curiosity, in our struggle, whether we are raising toddlers or we are empty nesters, that we will ruthlessly seek to desire and to know you, and that our lives will become about never moving past the basics, that you'll give us the desire, the heart, the love, the discipline to orient our lives around you. And whatever pain comes in that process, that we will have a meaning underneath it that makes it worth it. And that we will gain perspective of who we are and why we are and where we're going. And so, God, I pray that you'll help us to build our lives on the solid foundation. And we will do what you said, Jesus, at the beginning and the end of your Sermon on the Mount, where you said, whoever hears these words and puts these words into practice is like a wise person who built their house on the rock. So God, we want to build our lives on the rock that is you. Help us to put this into practice. Help us to fail like beautifully for the sake of constantly looking for you. Help us to forgive one another. Help us to lean in and heal us in the process. Teach us how, and may we be that May we see your kingdom come here as it is in heaven. Change us, grow us, love us. And whatever the bite-sized step is, would you make it clear for us in different ways today? In your name we pray. And everybody said, amen and amen. Amen.